And hello everyone, welcome back to another tutorial. In a previous tutorial we took a look at reading JSON from a file. But in most cases you actually want to make a request to some sort of API and get JSON or some form of data from the API to your system. Now I've built a custom API just for this, so yt-api.stevesteacher.com. Now when you visit this, you'll actually just get this. You will need to add /quotes. Alright. And this is just a basic endpoint. We're not going to go too deep into like APIs and stuff because that's not what this current tutorial is focused on. But anyways, you'll notice we have this right here. We can actually paste this into Firefox. Firefox gives us a nice look at this JSON in a more readable form. So you'll have an ID, you'll have a quote, you'll have an offer, and this offer is another object, and a user with another, that's another object, and so on. Very similar to this JSON right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to query this endpoint, and we're going to get data from it. So first let's remove all this and just say import std / and we can say async dispatch http client JSON and options. Now we already know what most of these does. JSON allows us to read and parse JSON. Options allows us to say if something is an optional value, meaning it may not exist. HTTP client allows us to request data from some sort of website server or whatnot. And async dispatch allows us to create asynchronous code. And we'll get into what that is in a minute. So our first order of business is we need to define in nim how these objects look. I'll actually keep it open in Firefox so it's easier to see. So first we'll have an ID and quote, both of them, which are strings. So let's go here and say type quote object, which is an object. And let's leave the ID for now because that's a special one we'll need to do, and I'll explain later. So let's say quote, so we look here, quote, and that's a string. Then let me just size this up a bit. You'll notice we now have two objects we need to enter. One is called offer, which has these values in it. So let's create the offer object. So quote offer object. That is an object. And we can say name, which is a string. Language, which is a string. Age of death, and age of death will not be guaranteed to be here because not all of these people have died yet. For example, age of death here is 55, 56, 68, and here is no age of death because this offer has yet to perish. So age of death may not actually return anything. So in that case, we can say option int because it may return nothing. And then we can say date of birth, which in this case is a string. But in JavaScript terms, it's actually a date object. However, we do not have a date object in nim that can be simply compatible with this, at least as far as I know. So now we have the offer. So here we can just specify offer, quote offer object. And then finally, we can just create our quote user object, which is an object, and which is an object. There we go. We have our username. Now username does not always actually return anything. So here I have Carlos277. We have null. So it still exists, but this time we get null. So in that case, if it's null, again, we can just use option string. In nim, it doesn't really differentiate between an undefined null or just empty value. All of them will just kind of fall into option. Then we have verified, which is a boolean, and we have type, which is a string. But you'll notice type here is in blue because a type is a keyword in nim. Now you cannot do this with a keyword. So to avoid this, we can use these quotes, these backticks to say type, because type again is a keyword in nim, so we cannot use that as a key for this object. Then we have a user, and that will be a quote user object. And Bob's your uncle, here we have our object. However, we still need one more value, one more key, and that is this underscore ID. Now, some APIs won't use an underscore, some will, but it depends. But I chose to use one of the more difficult scenarios just to show you. But there are other alternatives to this in them. If you do not want to use the JSON parse method, so this right here, there are other alternatives to create JSON type objects that does not require what we're about to do. And you can just go look for a couple of libraries, and I'm sure you'll find quite a few. So we cannot go underscore ID string. Why? Because, let's take a look, invalid token underscore. Because it cannot start with an underscore. If I go x underscore, it's perfectly fine, but it cannot start with it. Now your first idea might be to do this, but that just expands there. Now it's colon equal symbol expected but got underscore. Expected backtick but got underscore. That is strange. So the way you get around this is by putting double quotes like this. But I have an auto formatter, so I'm just gonna save without formatting here. So now it will work. So you'll have to use quotes here because it starts with an underscore. So this is something you'll have to take note of if you're working with a field that has an underscore and then the ID. Alright. Now we can actually get to the asynchronous code. So let's create a procedure main. And this will have an async added to it, meaning this is an asynchronous function. Now, what exactly is asynchronous? Well, let's say we have a piece of code and we have to wait for it to get data from a specific input, from a website, because first it needs to load the website and then retrieve the data from it. We can use async to tell the program, hey, wait here until all the data has been fetched. So I'll get into actually showing you how this works. So just put a echo. So just put a var quote which is a sequence of quote object. And that can be equal to await. And I'm going to create this function later, fetch quote, and then echo quote at index 0. Now, whenever you create an asynchronous function, it is also highly recommended to just wrap it in a try and except block. Now, why is it important to do this? Because here we're going to actually fetch information from some sort of server or API or whatnot. When that data doesn't get fetched, so let's say your internet gets disconnected or that server is not online at the moment or something of that nature, when something goes wrong, your entire program will stop. So you'll need to use a try and except to make sure that your program still continues to run if the await fails. So basically what will happen is, let's say we say echo 1 here. And in here we say echo 2. Now what's going to happen is it's going to use echo 1. Then while it's fetching this data, it may take like a second or two. It's not going to do anything. Once it has the data, it's going to print out echo 2. However, if we were to remove this await here, then it will go echo 1, it will start the request here, print echo 2, and this may or may not work. So we can use await to wait for it. So it will actually wait for this to execute. It will wait for it to return data to it. That is what async and await does. That's asynchronous code. When you use async and await, you're just telling the program, hey, please wait for this function to finish executing first. But take note, async and await only really works with other asynchronous functions. Most functions are synchronous, not asynchronous, but synchronous, meaning they execute in the order you place them. It's only when you have an asynchronous function that you want to use async and await. When you do want to wait for a function, but they're not asynchronous, you could do wait for, and then just put the function here. Because we cannot use async and await at the top level of our program, we need to use wait for instead. Because this is still an asynchronous function main here, but we cannot await it. We cannot say await here. Because await cannot work. So if we actually take a look here, can only await inside of a procedure marked as async. Use wait for when calling a synchronous procedure in a non-async scope instead. Basically meaning we just need to say wait for because this is asynchronous and we cannot use async at the top level. Only once in a function or a procedure or whatnot. Cool. Let's actually create the fetch quotes procedure. So procedure fetch quotes. And now we actually need to specify what data does fetch quote return. How do we specify it returns in a synchronous type data? Meaning it's not going to return data now, but if we wait for it, it's going to return data later. Well, for that we can use future, meaning the data we'll be receiving will be provided to us in the future. So we won't have it right now, but if we wait for it later, meaning if we use async on it or await on it, we will receive that data. But if we don't, we might receive it much later than we expect. And if we can paste or put whatever data we're going to receive once we have waited for it. So sequence of quote object. And in here we can just say this will be in asynchronous function or procedure. And here we can actually say what we want to do. So we're going to say var client is equal to new async HTTP client. This means we're going to create a new asynchronous client, meaning it's going to try and get data in an asynchronous way. You could do this without using async and await, but that is up to you. Now here is where we actually request the data from that endpoint. So variable response is equal to await client.get, but remember you do have different ones. You do have async and then you have one without async. We are specifically looking at async, so we can also use await here. Anyways, we use await.get to get a get request, meaning get data from this API. And then we paste in our API endpoint. For now, I'm going to make this HTTP instead of HTTPS, and I'll explain why later. So here we're getting data from this API. Note this link will be in the description below, so you should be able to just copy and paste it. Also, the source code to that API is also open source, so you won't have to worry about what's it actually doing. You can actually go look at the code and see, oh wow, this API is very basic. It doesn't even do much. So yeah, you can actually go look at the code yourself if you want to. This will also be linked in the description below. I'll need to specify that because for the last month, I've been getting non-stop hits from YouTube saying, hey, you can't put these links in your description. But why not? I verified that they're okay. But no matter, it's fine. These links, YouTube, are owned by me, the creator, just saying. And they are all open source as well, meaning they cannot be malicious. You can go look at the code. I'm pretty sure it's pretty good. How do I know that? Because I made them. So please, YouTube, do not remove these links from the description. Alright, now here, I think for now I'm just going to await fetch quotes up here and comment this out. Now to get this data, we can just say var body, and we can make it equal to response.body. However, note, body here is actually a feature, so we're getting data again from the body. Now the body is just the part of the request we care about. You also have things like the headers, but these things are a little bit complex for our scenario. Unless you're becoming some sort of web developer, you don't need to know too much about this. You just primarily care about the body at this point. And let's say await. So we're waiting to get the data from this body that was stored in response. And then let's actually echo out body. And let's see what we get. And for now, I'm just going to say sequence void. There we go. Now if you run this, we get this. This is exactly the data that we requested. However, take note this body is in a string form. So this here, that's not JSON, that's just a regular piece of string. So what we can do is we can actually convert this JSON or this string into JSON by saying return parse JSON, which uses the JSON library we imported. We specify the body, and we say .to sequence quote object. So we're going to parse it and we're going to get JSON, but then we're going to say this JSON is actually of this type. So it's actually this right here. If we don't use to, we don't know how the data will look. Now, if I were to do this, and my bad, this here should use curly brackets. There we go. Now, if we were to run this, we get 1, we get 2, but after a wait, and then here in our sequence, or here we get an object that we requested, a quote object with the ID, the quote, the author, and we can even specify that we want a specific field. And there we go. Now we specified a specific field. And take note, if we were to remove this await here, we'll actually get an error because this here is actually of type future. But this means you can actually do this. You can start the request right here, and you can first run a bunch of other code that you want to run, such as these echoes, so there's not a wait between these echoes, and only once you really need the data, you can await it. Because then you can actually fetch the data, or you can finish fetching the data. So here it will actually start the request, but it will continue with the program. Perfect. Now look closely at how fast this now runs. We're going to get 1, 2 quickly, and then it's going to be a short wait. Then we're going to get 3 and the data we want. So make sure to take a look at it. 1, 2, and it took a while, and then we got 3 and false. So this is the nice part about await. You can await wherever you need, but you can start the function early. So we'll start running this function, but it will only actually wait for the whole function to complete once we use our wait. Alright, now let's backtrack a little bit. Let's go back up here to client.get. Because I said we're not going to use HTTP yet. And why did I say that? That is to show you that you can actually use both HTTP and HTTPS, but they actually come a little bit in different packages. Because if I try and run this right now, we'll actually get an error because HTTPS requires SSL in nim. To enable SSL in nim, it's as simple as going -d :SSL when you compile the program. This will allow you to make a request to HTTPS endpoints. And there we go. It worked like a charm. And that is basically both the async and the wait and a little bit of the HTTP client. Thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed and learned something new. And I will see you all again in the next nim tutorial.